on and talk about the COVID inquiry. This is a really important report, actually. The UK citizens were failed by their government's processes, planning and policy of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is according to the public inquiry that has been running. There were more than 235,000 deaths involving COVID-19 in the UK up to the end of 2023. And this report, which was published last night, says some of the financial and human cost may have been avoided if the country had actually been better prepared for the deadly outbreak in 2020. It's actually the first of 9 reports to be published by the COVID-19 inquiry, is looking at the state of the UK's structures and procedures that were in place to prepare and respond to a pandemic. It does not make easy reading this because it's 83,000 words long, but it basically shows there are massive flaws, or there were significant flaws, and essentially the authorities had prepared for the wrong pandemic. Now, Baroness Heather Hallett, the inquiry chair, is calling for radical reform. She's made 10 recommendations, including a major overhaul of how the UK government prepares for civil emergencies. And she said some really moving words, actually. Never again can a disease be allowed to lead to so many deaths and so much suffering. I've no hesitation in concluding the processes, planning and policy of the civil contingency structures across the UK failed the citizens of all 4 nations. There were serious errors on the part of the state and serious flaws in our emergency systems. This cannot be allowed to happen again. Well, joining me now is Darwin Friend, Head of Research at the Taxpayers Alliance. Good morning to you.
Good morning, David. Thanks for having me on the show.
Pleasure. Thanks ever so much for coming on. Look, this is the first of 9 reports. This is going on for a very long time. It can't be cheap.
No, absolutely not. And it's important to mention that it's good to see that the first module report has finally been released, and it is an important report that they've published. But as you say, this is all coming at the expense of taxpayers, and we've done a forecast at the Taxpayers Alliance showing that it's going to potentially cost £196 million, this inquiry, when the bill comes due. And that's going to make it the most expensive inquiry in history, both in a total cost and a cost per day, which is coming up at around about £130,000. And so I think whilst it's important that we obviously do look into the decisions that were made during the pandemic and what we can do better, it's also important to make sure that we're getting the best possible value for money, because it's ultimately taxpayers paying for it at the end of the day.
I mean, it is, but also the counter-argument is that they got 103,000 documents, 213 witness statements. They heard from 68 witnesses. That's just the first module. So this is a very detailed inquiry. My real worry about this is it's going to take so long to actually get all the recommendations and reports that people will have forgotten what it was like. And in the interim, of course, we may have another pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the current inquiry is expected to stop taking evidence in 2026. So we're still a couple of years away just from the evidence hearings ending, let alone actually getting all of the final reports out of the way. And something that I'm very keen that the inquiry does start looking into is actually the money that was spent during the pandemic, and also what other countries did, and kind of comparing the UK response to our international competitors and seeing how they perform differently and perhaps better in certain metrics, so that then when a potential next pandemic does occur, we can be as prepared as possible and use past experience to apply the best policies in response.
I mean, this is really damning. It basically said the UK lacked resilience, that we were ill-prepared for dealing with a catastrophic emergency, let alone the COVID-19 pandemic. It said, essentially, we prepared for entirely the wrong pandemic. The focus was on flu, and obviously it was inadequate for a global pandemic. We were completely wrong-footed by what was going on. Also, it says the institutions and structures responsible for the emergency planning were labyrinthine in their complexity. One of the other things that really struck me, I think, from this report was it talks about the role of devolution, that actually the different nations going in different ways. And remember, Nicola Sturgeon made a great deal of this, standing up, saying Scotland is going to do something different to the rest of the United Kingdom. Well, that's seen as a damning failure, a damning indictment of actually governance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what this report actually highlights is that we need to have more streamlined processes when these situations arise. We can't be constantly running through reams of red tape when we actually need decisions to be made and quick actions to be taken. And I think whilst it's understandable that the government in the immediate response to the pandemic obviously had to make some big decisions, such as locking down the country and then providing vast amounts of money in order to support businesses and families, I think the pandemic lasted for around about 18 months. And so, quite frankly, they needed to have the proper processes in place. So in the immediate aftermath of the immediate response, that they did have the proper processes in place to actually respond to the pandemic and support people throughout the country.
I mean, look, if you look at everything that we did, it was pretty dreadful. Test and trace was not up to scratch at all. The report says that actually there was no system to ensure that test and trace actually worked. We know about the PPE procurement where people were making their own garments. That was certainly, we were not prepared in that sense. There was also false science being used. Of course, those lockdowns that were imposed, we don't believe they were necessary, particularly after that first lockdown. And then, of course, you have the furlough scheme on top of that, which was instigated because we locked the whole country down. So there are huge amounts, huge lessons that need to be learned.
Definitely. And we've got a report actually out today showing the cost of the COVID pandemic and comparing it actually to some of our competitors in the OECD and how they performed. And what it actually shows is we had one of the highest amounts of spending on the pandemic throughout the entire OECD. We spent more than a third of our entire GDP, 36%. On the pandemic. And quite frankly, when you look at the excess deaths that we had as a result of the pandemic, we've got one of the highest levels, around about 109 per 100,000 of the population. And at the end of the day, what the government needs to remember, not only were they spending vast amounts of taxpayers' money on these schemes that quite often didn't support people in the long run, but ultimately, it's also going to now have to be paid for by people with debt and public spending still significantly higher than they were before the pandemic first started.
Well, that's right. And of course, Baroness Hannett is very clear that we need to learn lessons and we need to instigate solutions now. And of course, where's the accountability in all of this? And that's what people will be waking up this morning and thinking about. Actually, who takes the rap for what went wrong? Why did we get it so badly wrong? But obviously, it is costing a lot, but we need to learn those lessons. Darwin, thanks so much for coming on the show this morning. That's Darwin Friend, Head of Research at the Taxpayers Alliance.